Hello, good morning. Has everybody got, or can they see a handout? Excellent. Right, so this is functions of intonation, and hopefully you will have a sense of déjà vu as we go through. You will have a sense of having seen a lot of this before and heard a lot of this before, because inevitably it's going to cross-reference all the intonation really that you've had so far. We need to think about the range of functions and how they connect to what I'm calling the 3 T's. You will see what those are in a moment. And the range will cover things like the focusing function, the grammatical function, and the attitudinal function. These are sort of, I suppose, traditional broad functions, and we'll see they contribute more or less to the spoken message. So the range of functions and the 3 T's. 3 functions, as you've just seen in the points that we're actually going to discuss as the lecture goes by, are, first of all, the focusing function. Now, this relates very closely to tonicity, which we all talked about earlier on in the series last week. Tonicity, things like where the nucleus comes and so on. Not exclusively to tonicity, that's why we've got sort of ... afterwards, okay? But tonicity is one of the main contributing factors to the focusing function. The grammatical function, if any of the functions relate to tonality, it's the grammatical function. And tonality, you may remember, I think with Michael you will have looked at word dividing the utterance into intonation groups, chunking, that's tonality. Again, it's not exclusively tonality, there will be other things as well. And finally, the attitudinal function. I think this is the big thing. This is where intonation plays an enormously important part, and in particular in relation to your choice of nuclear tone. So there you are, 3 functions, and now all will be revealed, the 3 T's. Tonality, tonicity, and tone. So we get stuck straight in with the focusing function. Now, the focusing function, as I said, relates to tonicity, to the placement of the nucleus. But you know that tonicity is not just the placement of the nucleus. There are other things that you have to know before you can even decide where the nucleus is. You need to know about accents, and we saw that if you play with the accents, you can add a certain amount of extra emphasis to what's being said. So when we say that the focusing function relies particularly on tonicity, it does, but it relies on all the baggage that comes with tonicity. So the nucleus, the accents, and the idea of making things more emphatic. If you have a look on your handout, you'll find on the first page an example using the words "meet me by the clock in the station at 6. And it doesn't take a huge leap of the imagination now, I hope, to identify at least 4 lexical items in that, all of which are likely to attract a stress when the utterance is spoken. So we have meet me in the clock, sorry, meet me by the clock at station 6. So we've got these 4 beats. Marking it up for intonation, let's go for end focus. We saw that was the neutral, unmarked form of most utterances. So we put our nucleus at the end on a 6. And you'll notice that I slipped in a high full nuclear tone mark at the same time. So we've got 4 stresses, but we might want to be a bit more precise in our markup. And I probably change that a bit quickly. There are the stresses. 4 stress beats, which I changed just the last one to the nuclear tone mark. We know that if we're going to transcribe the head correctly, we need to replace those with little zeros, which is what I've done here. 4 stresses, 2 particularly prominent that we call accents. These are the 2 that have pitch prominence, just to remind you. Meet comes actually out of the blue, so it's compared with silence, so it's pitch prominent. And then 6 has pitch movement, so it's prominent for that reason. It's a moving tone. The last one is the nucleus. Now, relying on those 2 points of focus, because if you remember that's what accents do, they focus the listener's attention on the message. We've got a sort of incontrovertible message there, meet at 6. That might not be enough. You might need to fill in a bit more detail, and if you're going to need to fill in a bit more detail, you're going to need to think about adding more accents, adding more points of focus. And that's what I've done now. I've gone from the ordinary high head with the little circles to an emphatic stepping head. And by changing the type of prominence on those syllables, I've now got 4 accents, 4 points of focus, and all the information will be put across. Meet, clock, station, 6. Okay. Now the nucleus is free. Its only constraint is what message do I want the listener to hear. So if I took something like, okay, so we'll be at the station by 6, but where precisely do you want to meet? I can use exactly the same utterance that we've seen in examples 1 and 2. And I can shift the nucleus. Meet me by the clock in the station at 6. Because station and 6 are now out of focus, they're de-accented, they're no longer important. Still got my same 4 stresses. I've got 2 accents, just like I had when I first started, but the distribution of those points is different. The nucleus now comes much earlier on. I've got early focus instead of end focus. I now have a message, abbreviated in a different way, meet clock. That last example probably brings to mind something that you will almost certainly have heard about, the concept of contrastive focus or contrastive stress. And if we move on to a series of examples through example 4, 5, 6 and so on, I must find some. Now remember that the word some is one of these so-called empty categories, and that's going to repel the nucleus, other things being equal. So in this utterance we would say we've got end focus. The nucleus is on the last content word. Some is an empty category. I must find some. Okay? And it would be contrastive if somebody had just said something like, whoops, vanished, sorry, something's gone wrong. If something had just said something like, why not buy some? I must find some. I'm not going out to spend money gratuitously, I know there's some around. Okay? So even what we think of as being unmarked can have a contrastive function. It can be an instance of contrastive stress. If we play with those same 4 words and shift the free nucleus around, and we have example 5 where it says, I must find some. The emphasis now on the very real need to find some. We have early focus, and so the utterance is more marked linguistically. A contrastive statement in response to something like, don't worry if you can't find any. I must find some. I can't give up now. I'm not going to be beaten. All right? Moving on to example 6, I must find some. Now it's me, not anybody else. Again, very early focus, so again, a very marked sort of utterance. Contrastive statement. Perhaps the stimulus was, let her look for it. I must find some. I must do it myself. I can't rely on other people. interestingly, of course, remember that empty category. As soon as we put the nucleus right at the end, because it's an empty category, we've got another contrastive or marked scenario. Now that's quite surprising, which is why I put the marked in red, because all along our little rule has been end focus, unmarked, unremarkable. Now I must find some. That is definitely marked. And we have a contrastive statement, perhaps in response to something like, I don't expect you'll find any. I must find some. I know it's here somewhere. Okay? So that gives you some idea about tonicity and the role it plays in focusing the listener's attention on the message, determining what the listener hears. And that, I think, is a reasonable summary of the focusing function. So if we move on to the second function on our list, the third point that we need to talk about, we can begin to think a bit more about the relation between intonation and grammar. Now, we've met this a little bit before because we had some grammatical rules that we identified for determining the location of a nucleus. But there are other relationships. We can revisit some of that. We can add some more. And tonality is one of the defining characteristics here, how you chunk things up, but also tonicity again. And the two, of course, do to a certain extent go hand in glove, because you can't have a word, an intonation group without a nucleus. And so the definition of the group is that it will have a nucleus, it will have an instant of tonicity at its centre. Get that out of the way for a bit, because we've got lots of examples here. Example 8, word class membership. Now this should take you right back to the beginning of last week to the sorts of things that you were talking about or hearing about when Michael was lecturing on all the stress, rhythm, and fluency issues. We can have nouns and verbs in English which are distinguished exclusively by tonicity. And if you say it in isolation, the one word is the word group, the stressed syllable is accented, it is the nucleus. And I'm thinking about things like import versus import. Nothing changes there. You can see I've deliberately transcribed it for you. Nothing changes except the location of the nucleus. The segments stay exactly the same. All that's happened is this has hopped over to the second syllable. And there are lots of examples like that. Discount is another. Sometimes it's a more complex thing. Take-off. We're cleared for take-off. And the idea's really taken off. He's a dropout. I think he's dropped out. So the relationship now between nouns and phrasal type verbs. Verbs that come in two bits with a particle at the end. Exactly the same process though. The stress that you see here on the first syllable of the noun form hops over to the final syllable of the verb form. In all of those examples, and many more that you can think that would constitute parallel examples, the segments stay the same. But there are also other ones where the phonology, if you like, helps as well. If you can't hear the stress, then the sounds change a little bit too, to help. So, permit, with a long in the stressed syllable, when the stress hops, why hang about that long on the first syllable? We don't need permit, but permit. We get the first one over and done with. So we've got a typical example of strong, weak alternation there. The vowel, becomes shorter in that unstressed position. Sometimes, though, you've got strong, weak vowel relationships of the sort that you've got in subject versus subject, subject versus subject. And you've got stressed again weaken into schwa, to but you've got the I, which is on the weaker side of the stronger vowels. Remember, nothing is ever cut and dried in English. We can't categorically say it's always this and it's always that. There's all sort of gradations. We're always on a kind of scale. So if on the weaker side of the stronger vowels strengthens itself up to a proper F there, which is indisputably a strong vowel. So subject, subject. It's acquired another one while we were talking, but let's stick with blackbird. Let's be brave. Let's get rid of heavyweight. Okay, blackbird. That's the next one. You might not have heard of tall boys, but you will have heard of blackbirds. They are the birds with black feathers that go around whistling so loudly. But if you weren't quite sure about what sort of bird you were dealing with, it just coincidentally happened to have black feathers, you would have a noun phrase because you'd be talking about a black bird. And as we know, that could be a crow, a raven, a blackbird, all sorts of things are black in colour and feathered. And then a heavyweight champion, and a heavy weight, something that's very difficult, heavy to pick up. And finally, one that I always like, a big head. Big head, somebody who's really arrogant and sort of, up themselves and knows it all. But a big head is somebody who just needs a slightly larger hat size. I have a tiny head, in case anybody's interested. Need a very small hat size. Okay, so that's noun versus noun phrase. That's a sort of syntactic function. And this is a taste of more glorious syntactic functions to come. Because in example 10, we move on to the dizzy heights of relative clauses. Now, some of you will by this time be thinking, I don't know any of this, I don't even want to know any of this, but in fact it's quite handy. Relative clauses. Now if you've got a string of words like this, my cousin who lives in Cardiff works at the airport. English is a language where just because I've mentioned my cousin doesn't mean necessarily that's the only cousin I've got. It might be, or I might be distinguishing a particular cousin, defining for you a particular cousin out of a bunch of cousins. And intonation can help us to do that. If we want to turn this who lives in Cardiff into a defining relative clause, one that tells you exactly which cousin out of a number of cousins I'm talking about, it clubs up with the cousin in the same word group. We keep it all together. My cousin who lives in Cardiff, and they're so often done with that falling head and full rise, my cousin who lives in Cardiff works at the airport. And that leaves you thinking, okay, what about the one in Manchester, or the one in Blackpool, or the one in Brighton? Okay. I have other cousins. This one is defining the particular cousin living in Cardiff. Now I can use the same words if I've only got one cousin, but then both the tonality, well, particularly the tonality, and then subsequently the tonicity, because I'll need more nuclei if I've got more word groups, change. So let's see what happens if I've only got one cousin. My cousin, who lives in Cardiff, works at the airport. Now that's like I've said, my cousin works at the airport. I just happen to have put some brackets in, just to give you a sort of little bit of information about that person, coincidentally. And indeed, I can put as many things in the brackets as I like without altering the fact that I have only one cousin. My cousin, and it's like I said, who happens to live in Cardiff, who lives in Cardiff, works at the airport. And let's just see what we could do, how much we can pack in there. My cousin, who lives in Cardiff and drives a tractor, works at the airport. Still, I've only got one cousin. My cousin, who lives in Cardiff and dyes his hair pink, works at the airport. My cousin, who lives in Cardiff dyes his hair pink and keeps tarantulas, lives in Cardiff, and so we can go on. The sky's the limit. With all sorts of strange facts about my one and only cousin that I could tell you. But I have never gone back to putting the relative clause, the one that starts with who, inside the same group. All of these relative clauses are separate. And that's one cousin. Or even with a velar assimilation, that's one cousin. Right. Cousin's also very bling. Do you want to hear it? My cousin, who lives in Cardiff and drives a tractor and dyes his hair pink and keeps tarantulas and is very bling, works at the airport. Okay, we'll draw a veil over this particular cousin. It's not one I think I'm very keen for you to meet. Sometimes getting the relative clause right can help people. Sometimes it's very important and useful information. We've got another example at example 11 about parks and opening and closing times. If we want to define a particular park to save you a wasted journey, the park that's open this evening closes at 7. I might say the park that's open this evening is the one at the roundabout. I'm telling you something about that park which is open this evening. I am making sure that you don't go to any of the other parks. All right? But if there's only the one park, the park that's open this evening closes at 7. The park that's open this evening and has a boating lake closes at 7. The park closes at 7 is basically what I'm saying there. And I think that's the other thing to bear in mind, that what we've actually done here and also in my cousin is we have done what intonation often does, is given the subject of the sentence its own word group. So we're homing in on that one person, that one place. And that's another reason perhaps for us understanding that there is only one of them. So again, that is just the one park. Example 12. Now we're into adverbials. And again, getting the intonation right on adverbial forms can be very important because you can put across the wrong message. We have the words they and are and married and happily. If I say they're married happily, I am actually saying, isn't it fortunate that they're married? Perhaps they've entered a competition and it turns out that they've won, but they can only have the prize if they're a married couple. It is a prize for married couples. They're married happily. They're married fortunately. They're married luckily. I'm just saying, isn't it good that they are married? And that's what we would call a sentence adverbial. That's happily performing the role of a sentence adverbial. But if it's an adverb of manner, we've got a slightly different story. They're married happily. They're married happily. And that means they have a happy marriage. It's just a statement of fact. And of course, by having just the one moving tone, I have really only got one particular focus there as well. Here, look, we've used the complex, the compound tune. We've got a high fall on the nucleus, and then we add this as an afterthought afterwards, but because it's got moving pitch, again, it's drawing attention to itself. It's not like stresses in tails. It's applying another moving tone. It's almost as if you've got an accent, dare I say it, in the tail. Very contentious theoretical point back. It's almost as if I have. Okay? But they're married happily. Means they have a happy marriage. It's just a statement of fact. Another example of this in 13 takes different 4 words, and if it's a sentence adverbial, we'd have something like the brute behaved disastrously. The brute behaved disastrously. And what that actually means see how bad he can be, so that they could actually see for themselves the point that we've been making for weeks and weeks and weeks, the blighter behaved properly. So everybody still thinks we're making it up. Okay? The brute behaved disastrously, but if I revert to end focus, as I did with the happy marriage, the brute behaved disastrously. The brute behaved disastrously. And that means his behaviour was just unspeakable. It was bad. And you can come up again with lots and lots of those. They're quite entertaining. But as soon as you've got an adverb of manner, it's always just a single nucleus at the end on the adverb. Okay? The other thing about adverbs of manner is you could change the tonality. You can have the brute behaved disastrously. That then becomes a bit ambiguous, but you can break it up. Example 14, vocatives and apositives. I told you there was a sense of déjà vu. These are things that you've met before because we use the status of vocative and apositive for determining how many word groups and which would attract the nucleus. We're here with the boring old Mr. Jones, I'm afraid, but have you met our new neighbour, Mr. Jones? Have you met our new neighbour, Mr. Jones? I'm speaking to Mr. Jones. But have you met our new neighbour, Mr. Jones? That's now the name of the new neighbour, and we've got no idea who I'm talking to. Whoops, lost Mr. Jones. Okay. I think we did one before with Lubinka, if that rings any bells, but I've got a different name coming up next. Example 15. In a vocative, can you give it to the lab technician, Velda? I'm asking Velda to hand it over. I'm speaking to Velda. But can you give it to the lab technician, Velda? I now want to be sure that it goes to Velda and not to any of the other lab technicians. Velda is now in apposition to the lab technician. And you can see in each of those that tonality causes, in the apositive one, an extra word group. That in turn means that we've got 2 nuclei instead of 1. Okay. Now, I think the thing that you're probably thinking, and if you are, then you're thinking it correctly, about the grammatical function. I think the thing about the grammatical function is that there are always other ways of doing it. So intonation is not the be-all and end-all. You can restructure things. You can phrase it all a different way. There's all sorts of alternatives. But if you do phrase it the way the examples here have been phrased, then it is intonation that is distinguishing the different grammatical structures. But I think far and away the most interesting contribution that intonation makes to speech is at the level of attitude. Attitude is something which is spoken about a lot these days, isn't it? We talk about people having attitude, and that usually means they're a bit difficult to deal with. Often they have a sort of sense of self-importance that you feel may be slightly inflated. But there's an awful lot more, isn't there, to attitude than just that. There's the how you come across, even if you're not one of these people with attitude. Do you come across as caring, or do you come across as cold? Do you come across as energetic and lively, or do you come across as a bit subdued and hangdog? You know? There's all sorts of things to attitude. And many of these are things that are contributed through the intonation. Often, it has to be said, involuntarily. Because if you're actually feeling a bit under the weather, a bit ill, a bit tired, a bit hungover, yeah, probably. You know, all these things that make us feel slightly less buoyant than we would on a good day. It's very hard to override all of that in your intonation. And indeed, when that person that you've been trying to avoid for months meets you head on and there's no escape, isn't it start to be so pleased to see them. Super! No one has seen you for ages. It's terribly hard to do that. You normally do that when it's genuine. And so I think by the time we've got into attitude, we are also reaching the point where we realise just how much of a confidence trick intonation can be. We can be honest, we can be completely straightforward, but we can all also be totally duplicitous, totally two-faced, because we can suppress our feelings and put on this performance. I mean, you would never guess from listening to me and watching me how much I hate being here. It's not true. I couldn't do it. I could not keep up the performance if I hated being here. I just couldn't. It would be a totally different lecture, probably with very few hand gestures, quite apart from the intonation. So, yeah, I mean, intonation is tapping into something which is very deep inside of all of us on the emotional level. And because we don't normally articulate that, I mean, I wouldn't, for example, say, I'm feeling really off it this morning, so don't take offence, but hello, Leslie. We don't actually start with a kind of whole preamble that's going to set the emotional pitch or set the attitudinal pitch. And if I just said, hello, Leslie, Leslie would think, oh, I thought she liked me, you know, because I've put across completely the wrong attitude. And that's what we're going to be looking at here. Now, clearly, it can't be exhaustive. All we can do is like just taste what attitude has to offer, or what intonation has to offer in terms of attitude. But 9 times out of 10, it's done through tone. And when I was speaking to Leslie just now and demonstrating what might happen on a bad day, it's also linking into key. You may remember that thing about key. And hello, Leslie. It's very low key, completely different from hello, Leslie, which is more mid. Hello, Leslie, which is really high. Okay. Now, one of the things that might come across is whether you are being pleasant or unpleasant, nice or nasty. Somebody says to you, would you like some help? And the answer comes back, no thank you. Well, that's okay, it's a little bit off-putting, it's almost as if perhaps you shouldn't have asked, but it's reasonably neutral, it's not charged, it's not confrontational, it's not going to immediately provoke an outbreak of war. Would you like some help? No, thank you. That's not very nice at all. No, thank you. Mind your own business, how dare you intrude, you know? And that is very, very unpleasant. And supposing you're feeling incredibly cross about something, and it may not be the fault of the poor innocent bystander who's offering to help, that second one, no thank you, may be the way that you inadvertently or thoughtlessly answer them. Because intonation is linked so closely with how we are feeling. And it's only as you get older that you learn to de-link those two things, to disconnect those two things. To think, well, I'm feeling absolutely furious, but it's not his fault. I'd better try and be nice. How many times do I have to tell you? How many times do I have to tell you? Well, clearly I'm a bit fed up with something, but I'm still trying to keep it on an even keel. I'm still trying not to provoke an argument. I said something like this last night, actually, when I found the washing up there yet again when I got home, and 4 people in the house all contributing to it. How many times do I have to ask you? I said. Practicing today's lecture. But what I really wanted to say was, how many times do I have to tell you? How many times do I have to ask you? How many times do I... what I've done here is I've tried to keep, as I did in the other one, and we can now talk about it, the same tone, but I've changed to something a bit more extensive. Not just the tone, but the whole tune. I've actually changed the head combination. as soon as you change the head combination with a low rise, you can be very grumpy indeed. Okay? But I thought grump wasn't the best thing when I'd only just walked through the front door, so I did try to be nice. I'll tell you something funny as well. I also made a sandwich. And because there was nowhere to put anything, I made it on one plate with one knife. And when I'd eaten it, I put the plate and the knife with the rest of the washing up on the draining board. And after I tried out the how many times do I have to tell you, and people had come and done their washing up, I went back through the kitchen, and on the draining board was my one plate and one knife. Now, believe me, intonationally, that could have been completely disastrous. In fact, they'd all gone out, so I never got a chance to really... I think it would have been kind of high-key, high-flow. I think I might have sprained my larynx, actually. I was so cross at that point. But yeah, pleasant and unpleasant. And we can be deliberately pleasant even when we're feeling nasty. And that's already, I mean, that's nice for the people listening to us, isn't it? But it's already deceitful on our part. But it's a question of social protocol. It's the proper thing to do. It's the nice thing to do. It's the best thing to do. And that's what we try to do. It just doesn't always work. I've mentioned key, and key does obviously play a role in this. Shall we meet at 6 then? And this is an example I think we have seen before. The answer comes back, yes, fine. That's a kind of midish to high key, and it's very positive. It puts across a positive attitude on the part of the speaker. Shall we meet at 6 then? Yes, fine. Now what I've done here, look, do you remember I introduced arrows pointing, I think, probably up or down to suggest high key up, low key down. You'll find it in the previous handout. We had it, I think, in the previous lecture. And I mentioned that it's the sort of thing, sort of strategy that we will find in much of the discourse literature. That's the technical stuff, not the just, phone numbers, bus numbers, and questions and things, but technical stuff, technical description of intonation. Find it particularly in books by David Crystal and so forth, in his more theoretical intonational mode. So I'm using that there to show low key, using a downward pointing arrow. And I think there's also a reminder in your handout. And yes, fine. That's no longer positive, is it? That comes across as being a very negative sort of response. Shall we meet at 6 then? Yes, fine. You've got real misgivings about going to that meeting if somebody speaks to you that way. Sure. Nobody is so thick-skinned that they don't actually tune in to these messages. We're all very vulnerable when it comes to intonation. We might be very, tough cookies, but intonation always gets to you. Intonation is the thing that sets the questions going, sets the alarm bells ringing. And in fact, highlights our insecurities, doesn't it? Is it my fault, you start thinking? Did I do something? Did I say something? All because of, yes, fine, a low fall in a low key that you're not expecting. Positive or negative again? You've just opened a truly hideous gift from your great aunt. Think about it. Perhaps it's pink, fluffy bedroom slippers with little twinkly silver bits on that play a tune as you go upstairs. The ultimate in naff tat. The thing that nobody wants, the thing that goes straight away to the charity shop. She's sitting watching you. It's your birthday and she's just arrived, just bought this present. Oh, thanks. That's super. Now, your great aunt might be elderly, but she's into that sort of, and she knows you are not being nice. She knows there's something wrong. She probably won't say, oh dear, don't you like it, dear? I thought it was a really nice present. I got it down the market. She probably won't say that at all. She'll just go away feeling a little bit aggrieved at the rudeness of youth. She probably talk to her friends about it. Aunt Polly wasn't very nice when she opened my parcel, she'll say. So what you need to do when you open those hideous slippers is to say, oh, thanks, that's super. Yes. And if you're really lucky, she'll bring you some more next year, then. She'll know how much you like it. Okay? Because that comes across as being positive. And this is what I mean by how deceitful we can be. And we do it all the time for all sorts of reasons. And I suppose it's okay, up to a point, because it keeps the social order ticking nicely. And we don't want to offend people just for the sake of it. Polite or impolite, then? The news is on at 9, and we've now moved to example 20. It's not. It's a 10. That's a bit rude. It's not. It's a 10. The news is on at 9. It's not. It's a 10. You've forgotten they've moved it, you know? And that's okay. Because that's just saying, not, you are stupid, you ought to know, you should have read the Radio Times, it's been at 10 for months. That's saying, I am making it as if it was just a slip of the tongue on your part. I know you're not really stupid. You know, you're being nice. So you're actually being very polite. You're correcting somebody, you are actually pointing out that they've goofed, but you're doing it as nicely as you can. And the way we do that is with the full rise, rather than things like the high fall. The high fall can be even worse. I could have said something like, it's not. It's a 10. It's not. It's a 10. And I've got a rise and a fall. And it's all very abrupt. So, I mean, I could go even sort of more extreme than the rude I've got here. But I think it's much better just to be polite. If not, it's a 10. Then if they argue, you can go for the jugular, can't you? You can have a really good argument and you can use all the intonation tunes. But they probably won't argue because they'll realise you're right. And they'll be very glad not to have lost face because you've done it in such a nice way. Please be home by 8. Got my mum hat on. Please be home by 8. Daughter says, why? My friends can stay out till 10. We've had arguments like this, not anymore because she's grown up, but we certainly used to have arguments like that. That is so rude. And that's the thing that, you know, mum is, you speak to me like that and you won't go out at all. Don't use that tone of voice with me. Just think about what you're saying before you say it, and so on. And it's all up to the intonation. Mum will not say, awfully sorry, darling, but you picked the wrong nuclear tone. If you do, believe me, it's a showstopper. I have also done that. And what I got was instant deflation from somebody who was about to launch into another diatribe. What? So, it was a confrontation avoided. Much better, however, had she answered something like, why? My friends can stay out till 10. This makes mum think that perhaps daughter thinks that she said the wrong number. You know, and you can actually then have a meaningful dialogue about it because you haven't broken down the relationship. You have been much more polite. So it makes it look as if there might be a misunderstanding. But you see, it's only when daughter gets to something like 16, 17, 18 that they begin to be sensitive to that. Daughter at 12 going on 21 hasn't actually mastered those subtleties yet. Now, you know, we talk about how long it takes to learn a language, and how long it takes for it all to be completed and all the rest of it. And we all know that Russians don't know it all until they're well past the age of 12 to 15 because the verbs are so difficult. But we imagine that a language like English is mastered much earlier, much sooner than that, by the time, say, somebody's 7, 8, 9, 10. You hear good intonation, you know, they seem to be, but these subtle social things come much, much later. And I'm sure it's partly hormonally linked as well, because hormones and emotion and everything are so interlocked. And it'd be really good to see some studies on that, but there aren't very many. Surprise! I hear Breches have triplets. Triplets? This is the one we had the other day. I think we had it with twins. We've got the stakes now. Very surprised. Probably a question. Triplets? Have I heard you correctly? Triplets? That's the kind of surprised exclamation. High key. But then along comes old sour grapes and says, triplets? That's a kind of suspicious questioning checkup. And at that point I would have to... So, you're implying more than is being actually said there. And what you're saying is, don't ask me anything else. I'll make this one compliment, smashing colour. Let's talk about something different. If the person then comes back and says, well, the colour, yes, but what about the feathers and the fruit and the, you know. That's just asking for trouble. Asking for trouble. They should be sensitive to your use of the full rise. Enough is enough. And we're nearly there. You're laughing already, but we're only just getting to humour in example 25. Just one I heard actually years ago, I quite like using chopsticks. And somebody said, really? What do you find to do with them? Thank you.